First of all, thank you, Professor Liu and his team, for welcoming me and hosting me here in Taiwan. I've had a very wonderful few days, and I was very, very impressed by all I've seen. So thank you for doing all that, and I apologize for not being able to speak Chinese. So you have to stick with English. My topic is increasing the management effectiveness through assessments, and I'm elaborating a little bit on the example of Germany's national parks, and just give you a brief idea about the geography. This is the scope area of WCPA Europe. Germany sits, that's Germany right there, and my institution sits up in northern Germany, the one with the circle around it. There's other institutions like our academy, which trains people in nature conservation and wildlife management. So we are a network throughout most of the German federal states, and I'm from the northern states of Lower Saxony. This is where I work, and now we'll start with the real content. So first of all, if you're not familiar with the situation of national parks in Germany, we have 16. They are, most of them, quite tiny compared to an international level. What you might find interesting is that you see that most of them are in peripheral areas close either to the coast or to bordering countries. The state of North Rhine-Westphalia here is just for illustration. It's about the same size as Taiwan. So you can see that in comparison, our national parks are more sparsely and more distributed throughout the country. And the overall area is only about 1 million of hectares, of which 20% are terrestrial area and 80% are marine. The reason is very simple. Less people live in the marine world and you have less conflict. So it was much easier to designate large coastal and marine national parks, whereas the terrestrial national parks are much smaller. We do have 3 categories of large protected areas. One is the national parks. We also have biosphere reserves under the UNESCO MAB program, of which we have 18, which cover about 4% of the terrestrial area in Germany. And then we have another category called nature parks, which do have conservation objectives, but also have objectives in terms of regional sustainable development, sustainable tourism, and recreation. And of those nature parks, we have about 104, and they cover about 28% of Germany's surface area. So strict protected areas are quite small. Lower category large protected areas make up quite a large amount of the area in Germany. In terms of the evaluation of the national parks, it has been a longer process, which was initiated in about 2004, 2005, through a grant with the federal government. Some scientists developed a standard set of criteria for the quality of the management in the national parks. After these criteria and quality standards were developed, a first evaluation round took place between 2009 and 2012. At that time, we had 14 national parks. And then we had an interim evaluation to see whether the initiated evaluation had proven any early results. Also, between 2012 and 2015, 2 more national parks were designated, so that we're now at 16 parks. And during the interim evaluation, those 2 additional national parks also received the baseline evaluation. And then after that, between 2019 and 2021, the initial set of evaluation criteria was actually re-evaluated and then further developed. And that led to the second round of the national park assessment, which has just been completed at the end. Well, the official end was end of 2024. The reports were written by the end of 2025. So what I'm presenting here has just been very fresh released just a couple of weeks ago. And I have brought a few examples of the printed copy. I don't know where they are. They're very scarce. But I also have a QR code in the presentation. If you want to take a look at the whole report, it's available for download as an English PDF. Because I only have 20 minutes and the report is about 200 pages, there's not enough time to present all the results. So the second evaluation, which took place in 2022, from 2022 to 2024, I was part of the evaluation committee. It was based, as I said, on an advanced set of quality criteria and standards, and it aimed to establish a regular 10-year evaluation cycle while basically maintaining the procedure and the methodology of the first evaluation to deliver results that are comparable on a long-term basis. And also, it was meant to allow for a comparison between between the first round, the interim results, and then the results from the second round. Although the German national parks are not being evaluated on the basis that you can compare between the performance of the national parks. You can just basically refer to the initial evaluation, the interim evaluation, and the current evaluation to see the individual progress that each park has made, but there is no intercomparison between the national parks. This is due to, I would say, political reasons, simply because national parks in Germany are designated by the state governments, and the state governments in the federal states of Germany have not a big interest on being compared to their performance compared to the other federal states. So it has been done for political reasons. The evaluation methodology, just to illustrate you a little bit about this, the set of quality criteria was developed and endorsed by the Standing Working Group on Nature Conservation and Landscape Management between the federal government and all the state governments. As I said, the first initial version dates back to 2008. The data inventorying at that time, 10 so-called activity areas contained a total of 44 quality criteria, which might be considered more or less performance indicators. Each standard describes a clearly defined target state to be achieved by each national park or the National Park Administration. And based on the survey data that is being gathered, one tries to compare the actual state compared to the desired state. This procedure or this methodology was refined and further developed between 2019 and 2021 because some existing criteria proved that they had to be specified and also newer quality criteria such as relation to wilderness, sustainability, participation and inclusion had to be included, which were not part of the very first round. But in the end, the new set of quality criteria distinguishes between 8 different activities. I will show you in the graph in a minute what's included, with an overall of 42 quality criteria that are being assessed. And as I said earlier, the changes between the initial evaluation and the now existing set of quality criteria was done in a way that the comparison to the initial evaluation is still possible. So 2 slides with the overviews of the quality criteria. So the 8 activities, this is the official term. I don't really think that activity area is a good translation, but basically it's a task, or it's basically a management field. So management field 1 is an assessment of the framework conditions, which relates to, for example, the IUCN management categories for protected areas, to see whether the legal foundations are clear, whether conservation purposes have been made clear, or who has the responsibilities, who has the ownership rights, and so forth. Then from that one tries to get into further detail. So looking at the organizational structure, trying to assess, for example, personnel management, ranger service, how many rangers would work in a national park, what are the rangers' duties, are they able to fulfill their duties successfully. Also, we were looking at the finances. Then we have the management field of protection of natural biodiversity and dynamics, or natural dynamics. So this is the core field for assessment when you look from a conservation perspective, because here we're trying to compare the setup of the national parks, their objectives from a conservation perspective, and their achievements in that field. For most German national parks, this is no secret, the big obstacle is to achieve the 75% rule by IUCN in order to become a Category 2 national park. Many of the national parks have been designated in areas that traditionally had a lot of uses, and the German government has granted a little flexible, but about 30-year period for each national park to transition from the original national park with less than 75% natural dynamic zone towards the 75% rule. And we were of course looking at this. And then of course facts like state of habitat, habitat fragmentation, habitat status, also in terms of reporting duties to the European Commission, because most of the national parks, or all of the national parks, are also registered Natura 2000 sites. And then we're looking into activity area 4, which is the actual management that is taking place in order to achieve the conservation objectives. And that includes pretty much the steps that have been demonstrated here this morning in other presentations. So basically, the vision, the national park plan, restoration, species and habitat management measures, and then regulations, visitor management, and ranger patrol, for example. So those are the criteria applied here. And then the other activity areas, they're moving towards the relations between the national parks and the surrounding communities, because as you all know, national parks are not black boxes that exist and nothing else happens around it. So activity area 5, cooperation, sustainable regional development, is something that looks at the socio-economic factors that are being provided by the national parks. Also in relations to stakeholders, activity area 6, external communication, how well do the national parks communicate with the surrounding communities, how well do they communicate with crucial stakeholder groups. And then we have 2 other purposes as activity areas that are being assessed that are part of the mandate of each national park in Germany. One is environmental education and interpretation, and the other one is research and monitoring, where also for each activity area indicators have been developed. So basically, as I said, 8 task areas or activity areas with 42 quality indicators that needed to be assessed. So how is the assessment being carried out? Based on these 42 quality criteria, each national park receives a survey, a standardized survey, where they have to put in a lot of information. So I think in total it was about probably 220 questions, so quite a lot of work for the national park administrations. But just for better understanding, the methodology behind this is a self-assessment. So the national parks provide the data. They also provide information on how well they perform. All this data goes into a database, and then the work of the evaluation committee starts. If you look carefully, somewhere on that picture is my face as well. This shows us in one of the national parks. So the evaluation committee's tasks are to verify the data that has been provided by the national park administrations. So after this has been confirmed, there's also always a 2 to 3 day field visit to each individual national park, where we had extensive interviews with the park administration, but also with the important stakeholders, for example, to see whether the perspective of the park managers is the same as the perspective of the local or regional stakeholders. And we had very interesting discussions there because, as you can imagine, as a densely populated country, many national parks have some minor conflicts with the local communities, and it's very important to get both perspectives to also write recommendations for the park administration later on. So in the end, what we did is we compared each target state of each quality criterion with the actual state in each national park, and we identified strengths and weaknesses for all individual quality criteria. And in the end, we also compared this to the first evaluation to see whether progress has been made. So if you identify a certain state, you want to know 10 years ago, was this about the same state, or was there any improvement, or was there any deterioration that's noticeable? Yeah, so as I said, we derived the recommendations. We also prioritized the recommendations because most parks received about, on average, 45 recommendations to improve their management, range from 24 to 66. So that means a lot of homework for each national park to do. And we prioritized because it is quite clear that with the current budget and funding situation, the parks will not be able to address all the different recommendations. Also, because all the parks are under supervisions of their individual state ministry. In some cases, the recommendations go to the ministry. For example, when it comes to improving the budget for the parks, that's not in the jurisdiction of the national parks, that's in the jurisdiction of the state ministry. So in the finally, this goes into a report. So an individual report for each national park. These individual reports are usually released on the websites of the parks, so they're transparent. But we have learned from the first evaluation round, not all parks have done this for some reason, but it's still voluntarily released, but it is published. And then there's the summary report, which you can either download or take one of the few copies I brought. And just as a final example, just to see how the report looks like, this is just one random criterion I picked. So basically, the activity area 1 has 6 quality criteria that are associated with the standards. Then the target standard, that's similar in each report, is put up there. This is how a national park should look in an ideal state. Then there is an assessment that is being written. And the assessment ends in the identification of strengths and weaknesses of each national park. So it's quite visible. If you just want to see strengths and weaknesses, you can look for each quality criterion on the table, and then you find the results. And then in the end, we do have recommendations for action. And these are actually also just examples from the overall summary report to see what could the key recommendations for each actions be, for each action field be. As I said, the central management objective is to allow natural dynamics. This is what we evaluated for in order that the parks might be able to achieve IUCN Category 2 in the next coming years. And the key factors that currently are obstacles to at least a huge success, I would say, are the human and financial resources. All national park administrations are basically not funded sufficiently and have staffing gaps. And that's a recommendation that, as I said earlier, the ministries need to solve and not the parks themselves. And just last slide, my personal conclusions. On the one hand, it is excellent that you have a 10-year cycle of evaluations because it leaves you enough time to actually see progress or deterioration, but this only works well if the individual evaluation reports are published. What I find very important is the last bullet point here. The current evaluation Germany does is pretty much an isolated approach that is not in line with any of the other international existing frameworks. And so one of the recommendations we made is that the next evaluation cycle, which should be launched in about 7 to 8 years from now, should be better aligned with international frameworks in order to also have a better comparison beyond the state of the national parks in Germany. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation and thank you for your attendance today.